Welcome to Rings and Things, where we discuss Tolkien adaptations and texts. We're just two hobbits from the Shire, one bringing the other along on this adventure. I'm your host, Agnes, and this is my co-host,
recurring guest star,
JD. So JD, today we're covering the second half of the Two Towers. One might even say the second tower.
The second tower. All right, so the movie starts with Helm's Deep. There's a scene here where Aragorn is eating some soup that is apparently not very good, and he drops casually that he is, well, maybe not that casually, he makes a game of it, but he's 87, and that's like the fifth character I am surprised by their age. It's a very recurring theme in this work.
Who were the other four?
Gollum, Gandalf, Sauron, a Bilbo a bit, but not as much. That's a distance fourth.
Okay.
Bilbo at least like 111, I don't know, it made a bit of sense, but like Gollum and Gandalf and Sauron being hundreds of years old, I think Aragorn being 87 is on level with that, though. It's like wild.
I mean, strictly speaking, Gandalf and Sauron have been in existence since the dawn of creation.
Yeah, that's pretty old.
But yeah, Aragorn's 87. He's one of the Dunedain. He's one of the Númenóreans. Descended from them, and like Eowyn points out in the movie, his people are blessed with long life. I think Aragorn lives to be like 209 or something.
Oh my goodness, is that like about average? They have an about double lifespan of a regular human.
Their lifespans waned over time.
Mm.
The first king of Númenor lived to be about 500. Mm-hmm. And then over time, their lives got shorter, like only 200.
Just only 200, yeah.
But yeah, Aragorn is a pretty fantastical guy. He's not supposed to be somebody that we relate to. He's supposed to be a grand fantasy figure.
Right, yeah. It's kind of downplayed for being supposed to be such a character. Like Gandalf is a character you could tell is not like a self-insert or aspirational or that's not his role in the journey. You're supposed to see him as like a powerful being, but Aragorn's kind of like, it's a slow creep. It's building up on it. And they keep dropping it slowly and slowly. It's really interesting.
The movie definitely tried to make him more relatable than the book does. And I feel like this is one of those extended scenes that draws on the book a little bit more and might not fit with who movie Aragorn is quite so much.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've only seen the extended versions. Even when I watched this years ago, I've only watched extended. So I never watched the theatrical cuts. Only director.
I started with the theatricals and then didn't realize there was an extended edition until I was watching it. I was like, I don't remember these scenes.
I would recommend, if you're like me and trying to start from the beginning, just jump straight into director's cut, because you're already going to be sitting for hours. You may as well add a little bit on and get those extra scenes, because a lot of them that turn out are really good. This scene I thought was really, really good. Maybe not direly important to include, but it's sometimes I raise an eyebrow and wonder why they cut it, other than I guess time, which would have been their concern. I
think it depends on the individual, whether you want to start with the theatrical or the extended. If someone's really opposed to watching it or, has reservations about it, I think starting with the theatrical is a solid choice. It does shave off a couple hours, which can really make or break a hesitant person's reception, and the theatricals are what they were cut for. So things like this, where it might not feel exactly like the rest of movie Aragorn, might not be the best use of a hesitant person's time. I had one more point about this scene. You mentioned earlier that Aragorn was eating stew that didn't really seem very good.
No, he couldn't keep it in his mouth.
I am personally offended by this scene because Aragorn would be grateful for any food that was given to him. He's been hungrier and eaten worse than this as a ranger in those 87 years of his life. That stew can't possibly have been that bad. It might not have been good. They were working on the road with meager rations and things like that. But it was edible. It was food. I'm sure that Aragorn would have been grateful for this.
I saw this note and I had an interesting comparison. This might be a director's cut side tangent, and it may be missing in the theatrical cut, but I did want to note, sometimes, as we've seen in this movie, your tastes change, and maybe this would have been fine to somebody who was used to living inside, but not to a trailsman, just like Golem not enjoying cooked food anymore. I don't think that's what they were going for, but again, I just always try to attack these from all the angles I can.
Oh, I appreciate that, but I think what I'm saying is the exact opposite of that. That someone who's been on the trail that much, a trailsman, is going to be less picky because he will have had times when he's hungry enough to eat suboptimal food.
Yeah, it really, really made the soup look unappetizing, though.
I've heard that this scene was meant to be an inside joke with the cast about how bad the catering was.
Oh my god. That's a really incredibly funny inside joke. I gotta give it to them for that.
But after the battle with the soup, then they have a battle with the orcs and wargs, and Aragorn falls off a cliff, and then he's saved by his horse.
Yeah, and there's some panic among his retinue and friends and allies about where he's gone. I really, really love that his horse, he kind of crawled on and said, like, take me home, or, well, not home, but where I need to go. I always love that. That happens a few times in a few different pieces of fiction, and every time it's just like, oh my god, that makes me want a horse, and I'm actually like a little bit afraid of them in person.
You mentioned that in our introsode, actually.
Right. Yeah. No, I know horses are recurring characters in most fantasy, but I just, anytime I'm in the presence of one, it is very much, it gives me pause at how big they are. If a scene gets me feeling warm about a horse, it was a very heart-touching scene. I feel like it was worth mentioning.
And I'm going to make your heart melt a little bit more and tell you that Viggo Mortensen actually bought that horse after filming.
Aw. Did he? I guess he probably had enough money to care for a horse, but like, that's just wild to me. That he's just like, I'm gonna keep you. That's so funny.
Yep. Now we've spent a fair bit of time talking about Aragorn here, and especially I was mentioning earlier how that 87 thing might not feel like it fits with his book character quite as much, and how the movie has made him more relatable. Mm-hmm. And this is actually a bit of a contention point with people who know the books really well, that they've made Aragorn more hesitant, more relatable. They've brought his character down to be more like a normal human, given him a character arc. Mm-hmm. As I was watching the movie this time, I was thinking about Aragorn and his character arc and the changes that had been made to him, and I was realizing that Aragorn goes through trying to send Arwen to the west when he's a much younger person, but they put it into this film and make it feel like he's living a much shorter life. But in that 87 years that he's been living, he's had a lot of time to deal with his hesitancies and unsureties. Perhaps this character arc is a side effect of bringing in the story of younger Aragorn that's told in the appendices to The Return of the King. There's like bonus director cut material in the appendices.
Oh, interesting.
And some of this stuff is being brought into the film. Mm-hmm. And so that this is what's causing the character arc to happen. Blending the younger Aragorn with the older Aragorn is giving us the hesitancy, the unsurety, and the character arc.
That makes a lot of sense. The fact that the storyline with him dealing with Arwen happened before the journey to destroy the ring in Rohan in the books.
It would have happened long, long before.
So when you combine that story and overlap it with this, it'll kind of necessitate him seeming younger if he's going through that. Whereas if he's gone through that in the past, that would, even if it wasn't a physical age thing, like mature him mentally.
Yeah, exactly. And then continuing on this romance arc, another thing I noticed this time that I hadn't really paid attention to before is that Aragorn basically tells Éowyn that he and Arwen aren't together. When she asks him who gave you that jewel, he says that she's going to the west, which, I mean, if I were Éowyn, I'd interpret that as, I'm hung up on this girl, but we're not together.
Yeah.
Which is actually really different than the books, because Aragorn and Arwen are very solid in their relationship. They've already gone through all this, like I said early, way before the book started. They dealt with all this. They know they're together.
Yeah.
So I feel like this really casts Eowyn's actions in a different light, whether she figures that Aragorn is available or not.
Right. It changes Aragorn a lot, too. It makes everything a lot more messy, which is fun, honestly. I'm for it. Although it does a little bit besmirch Aragorn. It's like, come on, guy. He's definitely, like you said, he makes it seem like they're not together when they're still working stuff out, which is very different than him being assured of his relationship.
Well, I gotta play devil's advocate here. He did tell Arwen to go take her boat to the west, and that was like the last thing he heard. And her whole "I'm gonna stay behind" thing was something that she decided on her own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm not too much judging him, but it does it makes things a bit messier for sure. And it may, like, you know, a self-assured a guy who's in that stage of his life in a relationship versus like in a messy breakup are two completely different people, and paints Aragorn in two completely different lights.
Definitely. One of the things that I struggle with the Two Towers movie is just how much not book material there is in it. And I don't just mean character adaptational choices like we've been discussing for Aragorn. And I don't even mean like a fun little scene with some good dialogue kind of thing, you know, like the 87 scene or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I clocked it. There's 30 minutes of what I'll call not book material at the beginning of the second half.
Oh my gosh.
It took a half hour to get to stuff from the book. And like I said, I like some of it. I don't like the fact that Aragorn doesn't like the stew, but, you know, I like the conversation they have. There's a lot of good stuff about that scene. Mm-hmm. But there's some of it that I really don't like the whole battle with the orcs and wargs and Aragorn falling off the cliff and all of that. Mm-hmm. I feel like didn't give much to the movie. Half hour's a lot of time. You could have done other book stuff with that instead of having the battle scene and wondering if Aragorn died for 10 minutes.
Yeah, the death fake out I feel like is especially bad. I do feel like the battle scene later on does make the Helm's Deep battle feel a little bit more intense because they already been picked off and stuff like that.
It was women and children. They weren't fighting anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. When they showed up in Helm's Deep and they were like arming children, I got the impression is because a lot of the good fighters got killed off in the warg battle, which I don't know if that's an accurate interpretation or not, but either way, I feel like that battle may have been good, but if Aragorn disappearing and coming back wasn't in the book, that was like very unnecessary, like adding stakes in for no good reason.
Yeah, not in the book.
And the battle could have been shorter too, and still had the same effect. It could have been just like a really quick raid and run off, and even still, it could have been off screen or just followed what the book did. I will say though, like again, I haven't reading the book and not knowing what they are. I did feel like that small battle did kind of up the tension later on. Personally,
that's valid. I appreciate that opinion. Thank you for letting me know about that. So next, we cut to Frodo and Sam, and you found out who Faramir was.
Oh, they have a discussion, and he reveals to Sam and Frodo not only that he's his brother in this discussion, but his brother is dead. They learn that Boromir, their companion, died when they were splitting up.
Yep, because Frodo and Sam didn't know that.
Yeah, and I hadn't realized that. That was quite the shock to me. It was definitely throws some question into their identity, and if they were friends with Boromir and traveling with him just before he died, how do you not know that he's dead? It makes their situation a little bit even more precarious.
And it's only been a couple days.
I will say, Faramir being his brother, I was hoping that I wasn't able to guess it like that, but I don't think I would have been thinking about it unless I was asked either. Maybe I wanted it to be more tricky because I was asked the question, but I think it would have been a bigger reveal if I wasn't thinking about it, like if I were just enjoying the movie without discussing it in between.
I just wanted to see what you would predict for it.
Yeah, no, I was talking about it as like, oh, it can't be his brother. That's too obvious. I think I basically said that, which I feel a bit like a jerk now because it totally was his brother. Sometimes this happens with Tolkien. I feel like his work has been adapted from so much that the tropes feel tired, but it was not tired at the time at all.
It was definitely the trope setter.
Yeah, honestly, we're gonna go into it very soon. But Faramir and Boromir they had a really fun and interesting brother relationship too.
And I will say, Tolkien does build on even more classic tropes than he does in Norse sagas and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when he does that, it's a very well-sourced trope, and then Tolkien brought these tropes into the modern consciousness.
Right, because he was an academic historian, so he knew these stories and kind of, I don't want to say turned it into pop literature, but made it more accessible to the mainstream audience.
Specifically, he was a medievalist, which meant that he studied medieval literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Beowulf was a big one that he studied. He spoke a bunch of relevant languages for this job, things like Old English and Old Norse, and he worked a lot with the Norse sagas as well. Anything in that Germanic region was what he really focused on.
And then it cuts a bit to Treebeard. He's giving some more exposition on Saruman, and he mentions again a mind of wheels and metal, so it's very heavy on the industrialization once again. Also, he's specifically, Treebeard put it, that Saruman no longer cares for things that grow, which I thought, I mean, I know he's a tree, but it was a very interesting observation on the dichotomy between like the industrial world and the natural world.
Things that grow can't be controlled.
Right. I just thought it was a very interesting observation. And that they can't be controlled, that's really good too.
Sauron ultimately wants to control. Sauron wants to control as well. Neither one have a good relationship with growing things because, I mean, have you ever had a tree and it just grows into the power lines?
Yeah, and then you got to pay somebody to come and cut it.
Or you could cut down the power lines.
True, yeah. I should have considered that.
Treebeard would tell you should cut down the power lines.
That is exactly what he would probably say. Honestly, Tolkien might too.
Tolkien has a really good letter, maybe we should look into it at some point, where he talks about trees being murdered in his neighborhood. Mm-hmm. That's his word, not mine, murder.
The more I learn about him, the more I feel bad for him, which I know isn't really, he probably wouldn't really care for that, but it's genuinely how I feel and it can't be helped.
People generally didn't like going on walks with him because he would just stop and stare at a tree for a half hour.
Yeah, I could see that being a little frustrating too, on the other hand, though.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to go on a walk with him either.
He's a very interesting guy, but sometimes interesting people are in the minutia hard to be around.
So we had an interesting Boromir flashback.
Yes, yeah, I was so happy to see this too, and I don't remember this from my first watch through. I don't remember Boromir being in a flashback. It was very, very fun to end up seeing him.
It might have been an extended scene, I'm not sure.
It was, but I did watch the extended version, but I also have a famously bad attention span and tried to watch them all in one go, so a lot of things got compressed. But yeah, no, this was super exciting to see Boromir back and in full plate armor, leading an army. I personally, not remembering it all, I felt super excited seeing it this watch through.
It's a great scene. Boromir in this scene is at his best. He's doing what he does best. He's a great leader of the army, and he's leading that army greatly. And I think it speaks to Boromir's character that he can so clearly be the favored son and yet still be kind to Faramir. The first thing we see in his interactions with Faramir is like a really confident, broing relationship. They're joking and they got each other's backs, and it would be really easy for Boromir to become as abusive as Denethor.
Right. There's a couple of things there. So for one thing, I feel like it shows how bad Boromir and Faramir's father treats Faramir, that even like his older brother's like, dude, you're going a little too far. Like, you have to go pretty far for that dynamic to exist between an older and younger brother. It also does, I think you were more hammering on this, it does show Boromir's like strength of character and being able to think for himself outside of what his father thinks of his own family. A lot of people do just default to looking to what their dad feels about family dynamics because they'll see him as like a leader. Like if even in like day-to-day life, most people, if there was two adults who had a parent who was feuding with the other child, it's very rare, I feel like, at least in my personal life, that like the two children would come up. Usually one would side with the parent and the other would be like the outcast or something like that. And that's the dynamic you'd expect to see, with Boromir siding with their father and putting Faramir even more down, as you said. But this does affect Faramir. Even with Boromir having his back, he really, his dad, I made a note, his dad is a little bit right. Like, he kind of is just worse Boromir. But his dad kind of saying that is like the cause of it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Boromir, he is sure of himself, and Faramir feels like he has to prove himself. And everything Faramir does that's questionable, and Boromir does that isn't, is because Faramir feels like he needs to go out of his way to make other people notice him, instead of just feeling self-assured in himself.
I am very interested in this observation that you make. I would like you to continue to watch Faramir's character development and give me periodic updates on how you feel about Faramir's character, even through this movie, but especially further on. Let me know what you think, and let's compare movie Faramir to book Faramir.
Ooh, that's fun. Yeah, even in this movie, there's a lot of development and growth with Faramir that I really enjoy. So it cuts to them preparing at Helm's Deep shortly after. This is the first time that language is used on screen to play a big plot role, I feel like. There is the speak, friend, and enter riddle. And then other than that, it just feels like flavor.
I think that's right.
Where, like, it's like, oh, these people, like, kind of can respect each other more because they know a secret language. But Aragorn and Legolas are discussing plans and preparations in Helm's Deep in front of an army of, it's a mix of veterans and old people and children, talking about how doomed they are. I feel like knowing Tolkien was, among other things, like really interested in linguistics. It's just interesting to note that they need to speak in Elvish to kind of conceal what they're arguing about. Because if they were speaking out loud about what they were, it would definitely just cause a massive panic, especially at the volume they were discussing it. I did also note down here, the Entmoot, Treebeard, is speaking to the Merry and Pippin in English, and then speaking to the trees in Entish, but the rest of the trees don't speak English. And then also there's a bit of back and forth where Treebeard's translating, and it feels like Merry and Pippin, have to translate back through Entish through Treebeard. So I was wondering, are the Ents just not interested in speaking the common language, or are they unable to? Does Treebeard have an ability the rest don't?
In the book, there is at least one other Ent who has a speaking role. Mm-hmm. I conclude that the other Ents can speak the common language, but perhaps choose not to.
And then Treebeard also mentions it takes a long time to say things in Entish, so we only say things that are worth saying. Is this like the Ents are choosing to not listen to the hobbits because it's not in Entish and they consider it unimportant? Is that kind of, am I constructing that right?
Or maybe it's going too fast for them to follow.
Maybe, which the reason I wanted to hammer on this is because I think maybe you mentioned perhaps that Tolkien was really into the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, they speaking two different languages. I feel like this was a subtle, like, historical Easter egg to that, was what I was kind of getting at with this note. I don't know if that's what he was going for, or if the book contains it and the movie doesn't. Either way, you said that there was more of the Ents who spoke common, but I kind of was like, they're discussing their politics and debating in a language they can't understand, and that's the vibes I got from it.
I would say that's about right. The Entmoot was there to discuss what the Ents were going to do about Isengard, mm-hmm. and they did it in Old Entish. There's way more about the details of the languages in the books, of course.
Yes.
There's entire appendices on the languages. We can certainly take a look at what roles the languages are playing in the books when we get there. In the movie, I think it was more just to show how other the Ents are.
Right.
How different they are, how different their approach is to thinking about the world.
And so this part also, it kind of, I don't know if my notes were split or if this scene was split, but Legolas and Aragorn earlier arguing about Helm's Deep, Legolas is like in despair and Aragorn is self-assured, which previously I feel like hasn't been the dynamic. I feel like Legolas has been the very assured one. But it's like it's well written. I don't think it's out of character. I think it's like really hammers home how desperate Helm's Deep is right now. Like if the elf is panicking, things are really dire.
I agree with your viewing of that. I also think it's important to remember that elves don't get sick and die. They don't die of old age. They can be killed in battle. And so Legolas might be facing down a more assured death than he ever really thought he'd be facing.
That's a good point. I did not think about that. I wasn't even sure 100% if that's absolutely the case, but elves just don't die from natural causes. That
They don't generally die of sickness or old age or anything like that. If you stab one or shoot one or throw one off a cliff, physics still works.
Yeah, that doesn't work too well on them. So that actually makes a lot more sense. And it leads me to wonder, like, why Legolas is so cool and collected throughout all the other scenes where they're in peril.
Probably to try to drive home how bad the peril is here.
Yeah.
Like you were saying. Like I said, I agreed with your viewing of it, that this is meant to emphasize how bad the situation is. And one of the things that happens when they're getting ready for the battle is when Aragorn is talking to the little boy, and he tells the boy that this is a good sword. I have a hot take. So, this scene gets a lot of flack. I'm going to give you all my soapbox presentation on this issue.
I'm listening.
The sword is notched and rusty. And I want to keep in mind that I'm not a sword expert, so maybe I'm not correct in my assessment. I think what Aragorn is saying is that the sword is well balanced and of high craftsmanship. It might not have been well cared for, it might need to be fixed up, but the balance and craftsmanship, they're not things that can be fixed, like notches or rust can be removed and hammered out a little bit with time. I think that this scene is meant to be something of a symbolism for the men of Helm's Deep. Like the sword, the people defending it are honorable and good, but lack training and organization. These things would be fixable with time, unlike their enemies, the Uruk-hai, who lack both the honor and the goodness that are present in Helm's Deep. This kid's sword is a good sword in the same way that Helm's Deep is defended by a good army.
Absolutely amazing. Stephen, add applause, please.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I noticed the line. I thought it was just showing Aragorn's just a cool guy who's trying to reassure a scared child. But yeah, no, that was all top-notch analysis on the scene. I think, not to delve too deep, but it kind of is like Tolkien's whole worldview, right? That, things were better. And so Aragorn saying this is a good sword in its roots is a little bit rusty, needs a little bit of work, but it's good in the base is almost analogous to, like, again, like you said, Tolkien's whole worldview when we were discussing in fairy stories about, like, the world is regressing, which again would naturally have, like, the good things are just good, even if they are a little bit weary and rusty.
I really like that analysis as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would have missed it. I wouldn't have put that together if you hadn't gotten there because again, like when I saw this scene, I was like, Aragorn's reassuring a kid who's about to fight in a war. Like I don't know, the children's soldiers really affected me. I mean, I'm a parent. Anytime a media has like that, it really, and again, they were trying to show how dire this holdout is. So it was good. It was very good, but it tugged at my heartstrings a bit watching such young kids wield weapons to defend themselves.
Understandable. The interpretation I absolutely don't like for this scene is the one that you were proposing, that Aragorn is just trying to reassure a kid with some empty reassurances. And the reason I don't like that is because it's actually quite against Tolkien's worldview to tell a lie to try to get a good end. Doing something bad to get something good is ends justifies the means, which is never okay in Tolkien's worldview.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what I like. I said at the start of the show, Tolkien. This work I love because the more you think about it, the more rich it gets. You know, like watching that scene, and on a surface level, you think that, and then there's a secondary analysis about it being a good sword at the base, and then you apply Tolkien's worldview to it, and it becomes a rich marble tapestry rather than just a basic story.
For sure. And this is just a movie scene. It's not something that's in the books, so...
That's true. I feel like a lot of the adaptations, since it's drawing from the book so much, it's not Tolkien's writing, but since it's kind of inspired by his writing, and like they're filling in blanks or adding scenes that are based on the scenes around it, there's a little bit of diffusion into them of Tolkien, although even though it's not literally his work, if that makes any sense. I'm not like die hard the adaptations are. When the adaptation is doing good, that's what it accomplishes.
That's what it should accomplish, yes.
Yes. I took a few notes here about Helm's Deep just being a really great siege scene. So the rain comes down, the orcs are marching. The face on that Theoden makes when the rain comes down made me giggle a bit. And then the very next scene, he says, "So it begins." It really sums up the emotions. Like it's dire. Like it's almost like the joke that they do is like, what could go wrong? And then it starts raining, and I don't know, countless kids shows. Stuff like that. It really felt like that almost.
I think we've all felt that way in some small, tiny, minuscule way.
Definitely. I also really want to touch on here, but this is something I'm going to go more into once we get past our rings into our things. I definitely could tell that the rain coming down in this scene when things were just getting worse, I felt like it could have really come from Tolkien's experience in the trenches of World War I, though. And that's the one thing I really know about his biography is that's something he had to live through. And I do often draw parallels to what a World War I soldier would experience and some of the stuff in Lord of the Rings.
Well, the rain is in the book.
Oh, yeah. No, there's like just being you're in a hole when you're doing trench warfare. So any rain turns into puddles and it's just the worst. And I've read a lot of accounts of that. It's not a pretty place to be.
A lot of people feel that the Dead Marshes was also influenced by his World War I experience.
Yeah, I regret not saying the Somme. I took a note about it, and I was going to expect myself to remember. There's a battle in World War I that's famous for having, they weren't trenches, they were artillery holes that filled with water, and there was just soldiers pooled up in them. Very grisly stuff.
Tolkien was there.
Yeah. Tolkien was at the Somme?
Yes.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense about the marshes then. But this is in the fantasy of Tolkien. I feel like, I don't want to say how battles are supposed to be, but like on an emotional level, I feel like this is like kind of what he wanted going into war, so to speak. He wanted to have brave men making the individual difference on the battlefield. And I feel like that and again, this is an adaptation. I have to read the work, the more I am reading about it and the more I'm thinking about it through this lens, the more excited I am to read these books. The Battle of Helm's Deep, like turning around last minute, as we'll discuss, and all of that, when they were like everything seems lost. Everything was going wrong on multiple fronts. The Uruk-hai really seemed like they had it basically. The elves were there. We didn't even mention them showing up, but in the movie they show up.
Yeah, the elves don't show up in the book. That the elves are a movie adaptation edition.
Which I thought was interesting because that was a good scene too. I don't know. I really like the second half, the last quarter, I guess you could say, of the Two Towers. Helm's Deep was really great for me. I really enjoyed it. So the elves not being like the stuff that isn't there, the elves not being there, that sword scene, just really, I don't know. It's a bit of a head scratcher for me. You also said though that the Frodo in the last episode you mentioned a lot of the Treebeard, the Frodo stuff, and the Battle of Helm's Deep were almost just like told in 3 lines. They didn't intersplice them like they did in the movie.
So Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Merry and Pippin's stories are somewhat spliced chapter by chapter. Mm-hmm. But Frodo and Sam is entirely the second half of the book.
Merry and Pippin and Treebeard being interspliced does make sense because once we get to the end, we'll discuss it a bit more. I would like to note, and I don't know if this was very much on purpose by the director or somebody else in the art direction for the adaptation. The Uruk-hai used crossbows, and the elves and men used longbows, which, considering Tolkien was from England, and England, again, famously was very proud of being able to outperform crossbows with longbows long past like when you would expect. It really makes me think about the historian who wrote this, who's against industrialization and proud to be from the British Isles. I asked you in the notes, was this mentioned in the books at all, to your knowledge, crossbows used by the Uruk-hai and orcs?
So I actually read this chapter today to Sam and Ben. And while I was reading it, I made sure to pay attention. And there's specific mentions of archers on both sides.
Right.
And I think we know that Legolas has a longbow specifically. Mm-hmm. He's the only elf who's actually at Helm's Deep in the book. Mm. But there's no other specific reference to crossbows or longbows. I do like this movie choice, though, for exactly the reasons that you outlined.
I'm a bit of a history nerd, so it made me think of like Tolkien's ghost smiling watching somebody pick the orcs with crossbows. I think he would have loved that. The last scene it does show, and this coming back to Faramir, Frodo and Sam. It shows him ending up making the right choice. An interesting callback I thought of when you said Boromir was the only one who resisted the ring's corruption. I don't know if Faramir truly was corrupted, but he was trying to capture the ring and then also decided to let Frodo go. So that's what ends up happening in this last scene. And somebody even mentions like you could be executed for this by law. Like, and Faramir said, "So be it," and let them go. So
when I said that Boromir was the only one to fall prey to the ring and then throw it off like that, two-pronged answer here. First of all, I would say that Faramir did not fall prey to the ring the way Boromir did. He didn't try to take the ring himself. He was just going to be sending it to his father in Gondor because he had daddy issues.
Right. So it wasn't a true fall to like the seductive power of the ring. It was just a social situation that involved, like, it may as well have been anything else without the magic influence of the ring. That was a powerful asset to be had.
The second point I want to make is that Faramir in the movie does have a lot more issue being tempted by the ring than Faramir in the books.
So in the books, it's not mentioned that he has any issue at all?
Faramir has almost no instance where we are told about any sort of temptation on his part from the ring. He's another one of these kind of larger-than-life figures. He's like a mini Aragorn, which was one of the things that you mentioned at the end of the last episode, was that Faramir reminded you of Aragorn.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting observation, since Faramir is supposed to be of a similar type of man to Aragorn. What it says in the books is that the blood of Westernesse runs nearly true in him, which is the same lineage that makes Aragorn be 87.
Okay, got it. I don't know what at all. I feel like I was just trying to think of who else he could even be related to. There's only so many humans that we know about, really.
But I thought it was really cool you picked up on that.
Yeah.
In the book, Faramir does not try to send the ring to Gondor. This adaptation choice in the movie is, I think, less problematic than making Gandalf oppose going to Helm's Deep. The reason being, Faramir almost sending the ring to Gondor makes a certain amount of sense given the premises we have to work with. Making Gandalf oppose going to Helm's Deep makes absolutely no strategic sense. It feels like someone watching this movie on the first time would have a problem with this.
Right.
Someone who's watching Faramir for the first time be tempted by the ring isn't going to be instantly turned off by the fact that yet another man had to struggle with the temptation from the One Ring to rule them all.
Yeah, I was interested in hearing that Faramir didn't struggle with it. He didn't send him to Gondor either. We'll read the books, but could you briefly sum up what Faramir's role is in the books then, if it's not to divert Frodo and send him off track?
He gives him some provisions. He curses Gollum.
Interesting. That's a major change. I don't know. I really like Faramir's arc in the movie. I'd be interested to read it in the books. I know a lot of changes have to be made because some things don't translate as well on screen, just generally. And I don't know if this, and I'll have to reserve my judgment for once we read it, but I don't know if this was just to add tension again, like Aragorn going missing for 10 minutes, or if this was something deeper. I'm gonna reserve my judgment till I read book Faramir and can compare them to film Faramir.
Which is part of why I was really interested in your comment about that you thought he was a worse Boromir.
Yeah, so in the books, that's not the dynamic at all, I would imagine.
I will let you make your own conclusions about what it is that you are reading. I'm interested to hear.
Yeah, stay tuned, listeners. So during the scene or shortly after, Frodo is approached by a Nazgul, flying Nazgul, and he just almost hands it right off to him. And the only thing that stops him, I think, is Sam pulling him back. What is that about?
Movie drama. It's not how I think it would have worked in the books. I think the movie is trying to depict that the ring makes Frodo susceptible to suggestions from the Nazgul, the ring wraiths. The ring does wear Frodo's will down, and perhaps the movie is taking this way to show that visually, but Frodo would never give up the ring. Like, that's... He toys with it, he thinks about it, but he couldn't even throw it in the fire at Bag End at the very beginning. He's not going to give it up to a ring wraith.
Right, yeah, that's not how the ring works. I do wonder, and I probably asked you this at least 3 times, probably gonna a lot more. Is it Peter Jackson?
The director's name is Peter Jackson.
Oh, I remembered it. Awesome. Okay, so I wonder if, and I don't mean to think I could do better to directing a film than Peter Jackson. If they wanted to do that, it would have been really cool to just have the same exact scene, but then show Frodo was daydreaming or dozing off and cut to a way to show that that's not physically what happened, while still showing it wearing on him on the screen. Do you feel like that's more accurate to kind of book depictions of the ring wearing on him?
I think that would be a really interesting medium to use to try to show how the ring is affecting Frodo, for sure, because in the book, a lot of the wearing on Frodo, I feel like, comes from the narrator, not from anything actually happening, which is part of why movie Frodo, to me anyway, feels a bit whiny and things like that. What the movie is trying to do is to explain what the ring is doing. Book Frodo has a much stiffer lip and really doesn't complain.
Yeah. I feel for movie Frodo. I probably will feel more for book Frodo, but I do feel for movie Frodo. Is there anything between this scene and the end that I'm missing here? That's where my notes end.
Well, how about if we jump into our things and talk about our favorite quotes?
Okay.
The very last thing of the movie is Sam's speech right before they walk off with Gollum.
I'll let you pick the best quote this time, because I feel like I sniped him from you a few times. You can say that one's your favorite if you want.
Well, Sam's speech can be for both of us because it's the highlight of the whole movie, really.
Yeah, it was amazing.
I'll give you the honor of saying the quote, though.
Okay, so after Frodo says, "I can't do it, Sam goes, "I know, it's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are. It's like the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know then. How could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something." And then Frodo asks Sam, "What are we holding on to, Sam?" And Sam replies that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for.
The speech is taken from a lot of different places where Sam has little nuggets of wisdom throughout the books, and it's a great speech that has all of his big quotes put together like this. Mm-hmm. I really like it. It's a great speech to just be super motivational when you're not feeling the best. Like, who can listen to Sam's speech and not feel better after?
Right. Yes. Yeah. It was very good writing. Sam's such he's a very good person too. Well, very good hobbit, I guess.
Would you like to pick another quote?
My other quote is, and I mentioned it earlier, but the "So It Begins" by Theoden, and again, it's a context based quote, but I do regularly think this to myself, and thinking of the scene of his face being hit by the rain while being surrounded by enemies is definitely something I think quite often when I'm going through it in life.
It's a good one. So when I've been picking my favorite quotes, a lot of the time I've been trying to restrict myself only to movie quotes. Since we're talking about the movies, I'll have time to talk about my favorite book quotes when I get to the books.
Right.
Since this movie was like 50% movie quotes, I want to talk about a couple extra quotes than a couple more than I usually do.
Fair enough. Okay, quick follow-up question to you only using movie exclusive quotes. Have you been keeping track of how often I pick quotes that are also in the books as well?
You often pick quotes that are at least based on the books.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I'd like to hear some more of your quotes. I'm happy that you're bending the rules this time instead of me.
So one of my favorite quotes is Pippin's quote to Treebeard. "The closer we are to danger, the farther we are from harm. It's the last thing he'll expect."
That one rose an eyebrow for me. That was a bit, I mean, it worked out, but that's some backwards logic, I'd say.
The scriptwriters actually didn't have a line for Pippin for this one, and they told Billy Boyd, the actor, to make something up. And this is what he made up on the spot when they were filming because he couldn't think of anything to say.
It really fits the character, and like I said, it works out, so I love it. That's really funny.
One of the quotes that is... I'm going to nominate this quote for most subtle Lord of the Rings quote to throw into a conversation. "I know his uses, and they are few."
That was regarding Faramir from his own father too, right?
That was from Denethor about Faramir, but you could use it in response to any piece of junk that you're working with. "I know its uses, and they are few."
Hopefully not your children, but yeah. The coworkers, I could definitely see throwing that around a bit at work.
So, shall we jump into our language, lore, and letters section?
Yes, I'm very excited for this week's.
So this week, I wanted to take a look at the foreword to the Fellowship of the Ring. The reason I wanted to take a look at this next, after on fairy stories, was because in that essay, we touched on the idea that application was different than allegory.
Yes, which he very much expounds on here.
That's exactly why I wanted to look at this next, was to focus on some of the big ideas that he puts in the foreword, one of which was application and allegory. Now, when The Lord of the Rings was published, shortly after, it was a pretty common idea that The Lord of the Rings was an allegory for World War II. World War II had just wrapped up. The Fellowship was published in 1954. Other books after that. So World War II was on everyone's mind. But Tolkien addresses this idea and he refutes it, first by pointing out that he began to write the sequel to The Hobbit, which is how The Lord of the Rings began. It was as a sequel to The Hobbit. He was writing this way before World War II happened.
So I, when reading this, at least this section, tried to put my shoes into somebody reading this book when it was published in the 50s. And I put on a little bit of a skeptic's cap, but I will say Tolkien did convince me by the end. But I was like, really, this isn't, and we'll go more into it, but really, like, this came out, The Hobbit came out before World War II, The Lord of the Rings came out after, and the scale and everything's greater, so I was curious to see what he had to say. I've heard also this one referenced a few times, just that he didn't like his work being compared. I thought it was just generally to history and allegory, which is kind of true, as we'll see. But let's continue with his foreword.
Well, just as a little aside, just because this is what he says, if you read the book and you get something else out of it, it's my opinion that what the author says about his work is interesting insofar as the author has said it, but an author can also be wrong about his work.
Well, I think, and later he'll expound on this, but he does break down allegory versus applicability. Once we get into that, I'll share a bit more about where I was convinced by what he had to say.
The next thing in the foreword is that Tolkien asserts that, quote, "As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. What Tolkien calls his prime motive in writing The Lord of the Rings, quote, was the desire of a tale-teller to try his hand at a really long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times maybe excite them or deeply move them." So Tolkien here is saying that he didn't intend to write an allegory for World War II. He just wanted to write a good story for his readers. He didn't have ring equals atomic bomb in mind when he was writing this.
Right.
He didn't even have any particular topic in mind that he was writing about, allegorical nor topical. Not only did he not have equal signs across things to make a strict allegory, he wasn't even thinking of any one particular topic.
Yeah, and the fact that like he started to write about the ring in that way, and like he said, if we're following his timeline, 37 or 38, before The Hobbit was even officially published, so it'd be what, 36 or 37 then. That was, well, the ring was already being talked about like a massive, threat to the world like it is, and that was before the first inkling of like atomic weapon development, if we're using that allegory. That really the timeline does throw that off quite a bit already.
I think it was 39 was what he said in the foreword.
He said 30. He said the war broke out in 39, but I think he said he started writing it before the war broke out in 39. I think that's the most specific he gets.
Maybe that's what I'm remembering. The Hobbit was published in 37, and he started The Lord of the Rings after that was published.
Okay, got it.
One of the things that I thought was the most interesting from this foreword was the allegory that Tolkien lays out. Tolkien provides an alternate outline for how The Lord of the Rings might have gone if it were supposed to be an allegory for World War II. Quote, "If World War II had inspired or directed the development of the legend, then certainly the ring would have been seized and used against Sauron. He would not have been annihilated but enslaved, and Barad-dûr would not have been destroyed but occupied. Saruman, failing to get possession of the ring, would, in the confusion and treacheries of the time, have found in Mordor the missing links in his own researches into ring lore, and before long he would have made a great ring of his own, with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. In that conflict both sides would have held hobbits in hatred and contempt. They would not long have survived even as slaves."
This part took me a while to wrap my head around. I think I did end up getting it. Do you want to explain, or do you want me to attempt to?
Well, what I get out of this is that he's tossing both sides under the bus in World War II. He's basically saying that the use of the atomic bomb by the Allies is tantamount to using the ring against Sauron, which was what Boromir wanted to do.
Yeah, it's the bad guy. Well, not really bad, but it's the antithetical to the theme and message of Lord of the Rings, yes.
It's the path that would seem wise, except that it would mean doing a bad thing to get a good end. And whoever uses the ring to throw down Sauron becomes the ruler himself. So whoever in the war, when you use the bomb to throw down your enemy, you place yourself in a role of domination, and then someone else is going to come along and develop his own ring, his own bomb, bigger bomb, and you're going to keep fighting. And does this sound like history? Does this sound familiar?
Yes. Yeah, it's a story I've heard, and I've also... I agree with a little bit with Tolkien as he goes on later and says the allegory has been played out. I've heard the story a lot on Cold War metaphors in fiction.
So this is yet another reason why Tolkien says that The Lord of the Rings can't be an allegory for World War II, because it doesn't end like World War II. You know, unfortunately, we don't see hobbits much anymore.
No. Yeah, if I'm getting at what he means by that, that was pretty scathing. That's like a pretty scathing metaphor in saying this is not an allegory for sure.
Mm-hmm. But there are other allegories that people would propose. And to those people, Tolkien says, quote, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author.
And with that, this entire thing clicked in me. I dropped my skeptic cap, and I, metaphorically speaking, nodding along, listening to this concert of words, and starting to really get the music and what he's saying. So, because I like to draw connections. I was confusing when he was saying allegory with applicability. There's a lot in Lord of the Rings that's applicable to both. I say World War I is the heaviest, World War II slightly, other parts of history, as I've mentioned in this very episode, and others. So I feel like it kind of got me down when he was saying, because at first I thought he was saying, don't compare this to the real world at all, where he's saying, I'm not doing that. That's not the meaning behind this, but parts of it may apply, is what I got from this paragraph. And when I was like, oh, I see what he's going with now.
Yeah, that's basically what I get from it as well, that Tolkien didn't have any particular allegory or topic in mind when he wrote this, and he wants his readers to make of it what they will, and to apply it to the real world how they will apply it. He's subcreated this entire world and made it super complicated and has filled it with good morals. He's filled it with his moral worldview, but how we apply it to the real world is what we would make of it. One of my favorite applications to make with The Lord of the Rings is the rings as AI.
Interesting. That could be a whole episode.
But he certainly didn't write The Lord of the Rings to write an application of the rings as AI.
Yeah. No. No way.
He didn't have to write The Lord of the Rings to apply to AI for it to be a valid application, though. So it's not that Lord of the Rings has no meaning in the real world, but that we can make our own meanings with it. And Tolkien admits that his work, quote, cannot remain wholly unaffected, end quote, by events in his life, but that using his life to explain his work is complicated, and in his opinion, uninteresting and unproductive.
Yeah, I felt a little bit burned by this because, just as I said in the last bullet point, I personally see Tolkien, his experience in World War I and living through, he wasn't a soldier in World War II, but he lived through World War II. You know, in effect, there's rations and bombing raids in the place he lived. His son was in it, I think I heard.
His son fought in it.
I can't help but just see the parallels between living through that in Lord of the Rings, and also, like I mentioned earlier, the fantasy of escaping that too, specifically. And that for me in my analysis is always where I go first, and I see a lot of interesting things when I go there. And I feel like when I read this, Tolkien was like, I see you, and it's a little bit boring. I'm like, oh man. But that's a fair critique, because like I said, it's the first place I go, but I don't think it's the only place you can go with his work in analysis.
And just because Tolkien thinks it's boring doesn't mean that you need to think it's boring too.
Yeah, I don't know. Tolkien, he's really sassy in his writings. Like I said, when we read the other lore and letters, this one and a little bit of On Fairy Stories. This is going to be a very odd comparison, but he reminds me of when I had to when I had to study Lenin and read his works. They're both just very, like, they are snappy and attack the audience directly, and like sometimes, like, when I'm reading a work, I'm like trying to like create and understand and comprehend, and then maybe even argue a little bit back. And Tolkien and also Lenin will make it feel like they're like hearing your thoughts, and will answer it in the next paragraph, and make you like they think a step ahead about what somebody who's reading this might think, and then retort on that. And it's very, like, they're both very crotchety and will take on, like, and kind of like snap at the people, but it's an essay. They're not actually directly insulting you, but it feels that way because of how much they get into their readers' minds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some element of guiding your thoughts.
Yeah, there probably is. Like, they will, like, it's maybe a good way to put it is like controlled opposition. Like, they'll think they're either going to agree with me at this point or they're going to think this. So the next thing I'm going to do is attack that. And I don't know, with Tolkien, a lot of times it's exactly what I'm thinking. And in fairy stories it happened, and then in the foreword to Lord of the Rings it happened to me twice in this foreword, where I was skeptical that it wasn't an allegory, and I was like, okay, well, then it's applicable to history, but also it's still really fun to look at his life. And again, he's like, of course I can't remain wholly unaffected by what I went through. Like, he was reading my mind. Very funny stuff, very interesting.
So I don't doubt that the Dead Marshes are influenced by what he saw in the Somme, and I fully expect that the rain at Helm's Deep was inspired by something he experienced in the war. But he also wasn't writing about World War I when he wrote that. He was just drawing on what he had experience with.
Yeah, I'm not saying that, World War II isn't a good allegory because World War I fits better. There isn't a one-to-one parallel for these characters and themes, and, like, he's combining it with a lot of his deep knowledge of ancient and classic, like, literature and folk tales too. But I do feel like there's a lot to be said about those elements for sure. Like, I'm not even on the fence about that, but there's some other things, like bigger picture things, themes throughout the movies that I feel definitely were deeply influenced by. So it's just somebody going through World War One. An example I can name off the top of my head would be industrialization. Going through and this, I could go on and on, so I will be as brief as I can. But the context of World War I was industrialization being brought to a massive scale in warfare. So, and I know you mentioned Tolkien already wasn't happy with industrialization just for, like, ruining the idyllic countryside, but going through, like, artillery fire and machine guns before people were dueling and exchanging swords and wearing white gloves, and that was the image of war before World War I could see having it out against using machinery in such a scale. And, it's like two-pronged, and there's probably multiple influences, but I definitely can see a lot of even the major themes coming from what he experienced in his life. From what I know, I haven't read a biography or anything on him, which I think I would like to do, but it also might make me drawing these conclusions a little bit even more prevalent, which I don't think is really what I want to do at this point in the show.
Well, Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien is a very good biography. I have read it.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, industrialization is probably the theme that I would consider the most allegorical theme in his work, just because it seems the most inescapable to me. It seems like the strongest instance of what he calls purposed domination of the author. Like, I don't think Tolkien would agree with anyone who came away reading his work saying, I think industrialization is a good thing.
Yeah, Saruman just was doing it wrong.
I would be interested to know if someone could construct a less negative view of industrialization from the text if he tried hard enough, but I don't feel especially motivated to try that exercise myself, since I'm fully convinced that everything bad about industrialization was intended to be there.
Yeah, no, he definitely was hammering the author allegory thing home. But again, that's only a part of Lord of the Rings. It's not the whole thing.
For sure.
Friendship and humility and pity are just as important themes in these books. I've heard this analysis and I just can't get it out of my head. One of my favorite people who I look to for, like, learning about world building, he dropped this about Tolkien. It stuck with me even though I hadn't delved into his world too deeply, but he said that the way that he sees it is Lord of the Rings is kind of like Tolkien writing what his expectation going into war would have been if the world was a just and fair and good place where people can make a difference. Nobody really dies permanently. I mean, Boromir does, but none of Frodo's friends are in true peril.
Merry and Pippin were in true peril with the orcs, I'd say.
Yes, but they made it out through like eucatastrophe and stuff like that. Where in the real world in World War One, your buddies just wouldn't have made it. There wouldn't be tree ends, to save them. They just faced against this horrible grindhouse that was made from 1,000 different forces of politics and technology and stuff like that. Like, and industrialization's still bad, but industrialization's effect on causing such mass carnage kind of caused like a societal shift on how we view conflicts. We don't see them as things that just are inevitable and good. We are very much, as a culture, more so than ever in the past, consider war a scary thing, and battle and conflict. Where the Lord of the Rings, it's scary, but it's an adventure, and that's how that was the selling point for the army in like pre-World War One for England. They would say, join for king and country and have an adventure. And that's kind of what I'm getting at when I feel like that is the most I can say that it's an allegory. It's almost like an aspirational allegory of what he thinks people should be going through instead of what we are. Reading this forward, this has been something that's kind of bouncing in my head as I'm watching these films, and I wanted to take a shot at kind of condensing it all.
I think there's definitely an element of fantasy escapism in how the battles and war is depicted, but also this is how a veteran of one of the worst wars ever chose to depict it, and I feel a little out of my depth trying to contradict how a veteran wanted to depict war.
Personally, I feel like this isn't him depicting what it was, but again...
Oh, certainly not.
I feel like this is him depicting what it should have been or wished it could have been in a way, which, again, like he lived in a different time and had different experiences, and he mentions it in this essay that you can't remain wholly unaffected. I also think if World War II never happened, The Lord of the Rings, a lot of the beats would have been similar, but it would have been a little bit less dire in tone. I feel like it definitely, that was the mood of the decade when he was writing it too.
He admits that.
But I do understand where he's saying, like, it's its own world and the consequences would have happened. I would have written it the same way no matter what. I do think it does affect the tone a bit, and I think that the bones of it still very much, I see personally his presumed experiences in World War One, which again I should research more into so I could make a more cohesive and structured argument. I know a lot about the battles of World War One though, and that's why I was I can name the psalm like off the top of my head, and also knew when you said the marshes were based off this battle, I was like, that must be the one. It's one of my interests, I guess you could say. I'm not going to go into it on this level very much at all, but I might poke at it a few times.
JD, do you believe in eucatastrophe?
In real life?
Yeah.
I suppose it's possible. I don't think it's often. That's asking me, like we said, almost if I believe in miracles, right?
It depends on if you want to use miracles instead of eucatastrophe.
Sure. I think it's possible. Definitely. Especially, certain things, like things just work out for the best and there's no point in questioning it. Why?
I just wondered. I hope that a belief in eucatastrophe can help make people more optimistic about the world. If not optimistic, at least calmer. Yeah.
I don't know if my worldview relies on that so much as just wait and see, because you never know, which I guess is in a roundabout way still you're hoping for something, right?
You're waiting for the eucatastrophe that you don't know what it is.
Yeah, exactly. So I went very long on that last thing, but we do have questions.
We have questions. Questions that need answering.
The question is from the Make Denethor Apologize for Eating That Tomato Committee. Aside from birth order, what did Faramir do to deserve such hate from his father? Also, what did Boromir do to be placed on a pedestal by his father?
So, I have a 3-prong answer to this.
Okay.
First, after Faramir's birth, Denethor's wife became ill and died 5 years later. I think that Denethor, who loved his wife very much, may have held Faramir responsible for that in some way and projected the illness of his wife and later death onto him. Second, I think that Denethor resents Gandalf's influence on Faramir. Boromir isn't a wizard's pupil. Denethor understands Gandalf to be working towards restoring Aragorn to the throne of Gondor, and he understands Gandalf to be usurping his power, so that Faramir, having a relationship with Gandalf, paints him as disloyal to the stewardship of Gondor. Faramir is basically consorting with someone who would take the power away from him. Faramir might even accept Aragorn as king. Imagine that.
The horror.
The horror. Denethor at least believed that Boromir would not accept Aragorn as king, should that ever happen.
That's a really interesting hypothetical. If he didn't become corrupted, what do you think would happen there? We could save it for another day, but that might be a fun what if.
There's some interesting speculative material in the book on this.
Okay. And you said there was 3 prongs. I have only counted 2.
The third one is that I think Denethor believed that victory could be attained by strength of arms, and whether Boromir believed this because of his father or reached this conclusion independently, they agreed on this. Faramir, on the other hand, understood that the glory was not in the battle nor in the weapons, but in that which they defended. Denethor might have seen Faramir's interest in lore and knowledge as maybe less masculine than Boromir's penchant for violence. I will admit this is perhaps a little bit of my reading on it, but this is at least how I read the characters. Faramir is certainly more book smart than battle smart compared to Boromir, who is more battle smart than book smart. I mean, they're both well educated and they're both good fighters, but the emphasis is definitely brawn and brains for Boromir and Faramir, respectively.
Right. Interesting. That last one is probably the closest to what my guess would have been. The other 2, I feel like, depend on facts that I did not know.
Well, I hope that answers the question for the Make Denethor Apologize for Eating That Tomato Committee. So before we close out the podcast, we have an announcement. We have a Patreon. A podcast is not free to produce. If you are enjoying the podcast, please consider contributing through the link in the description. There are several tiers you can select from to donate, along with some cool rewards, including access to a private Discord server, access to deleted clips from the show, and shoutouts at the end of the episodes. We also have stretch goals, including creating Patreon-exclusive video shorts and special podcasts, and even moving to weekly episodes. Every pledge helps.
You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram through the links in the description. Please follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and other major podcast platforms. To have your questions or comments featured on the podcast, please send an email to shirepost.ringsandthings@gmail.com.
A special thank you to our editor and spiritual producer, Stephen Jeffrey, and thank you for listening.